This is Lecture 3 on Chapter 2, entitled The Inner Workings of the Law Office. We've discussed the first several slides, and when we were last together, we looked at this organizational chart. This is just an example. There's lots of different ways that law firms are organized. Part of the organizational structure of a law firm has to do with its size. Obviously, there's more layers and more people who work in the organization. But at the end of the day, the people for whom you actually do work are the ones that are most important for them to think well of your work performance. That's the takeaway. Okay, let's talk about employment policies. I hate to make gross generalizations about any particular field, but since I'm an attorney, I guess I feel a little bit of leeway to make gross generalizations about my industry, and that is that for the most part, attorneys are very bad people managers. There's exceptions, of course. As soon as you say anything about any group of people, there's always going to be exceptions. But I think that you'll find this is true more often than not. I'll give you an example. I once worked at a place, and everybody in the whole company would get appraised once a year. Everyone. Every single person, except for the attorneys. No one ever appraised the attorneys. So that was an example about how there's an saying, the cobbler's children have no shoes. Well, sometimes the people who are worse at implementing policies that they're the ones who draft are the actual attorneys. So be aware of the fact that what the official policies might be in your law firm might be very different than what actually happens in a place. So it's good to look at the written policies, but it's also good to keep your eyes and ears open to see what actually happens. I'll give you an example. When I started working at a law firm in Houston, it's called Baker Botts. It's a very large law firm. I was told, actually even before I started, that I would have 3 weeks of vacation every year. From the first day that I started, I wouldn't have to accrue them. I could take 3 weeks of vacation on my very first day there. That astonished me. I was familiar with a corporate environment wherein to get 3 weeks of vacation, you usually had to work for a place several years. And here I was going to get it from day one. So it seemed very humane, very supportive of the employees. And it was true. Absolutely. You got 3 weeks of vacation. The problem was that you had to bill so many hours. So, yes, if you could bill, 2,200 hours in a year, and still take your 3 weeks of vacation, you could, of course, take your 3 weeks of vacation. They'd probably let you take more than that. The problem was, though, that if you were going to take 3 weeks off, you weren't going to get to your billable expectation. So it was kind of an illusory promise. No one actually took that amount of time. Some people joked and said that we did get 3 weeks of vacation. You could take off several Saturdays during the course of the year, and that would count as your vacation time. And the individuals saying that were only halfway joking. But that's an example of the difference between written and unwritten policies. The larger the law firm is, the more likely they will have written policies. And these will likely cover things like what holidays the firm is closed, what the sick pay policy is, how much vacation time, what are the procedures that you need to use for vacation time in order to take off certain days, and under what bases your employment might be ended, things along those lines. It's good to look at those formal policies, but it's also good to have a healthy level of skepticism about it. They are there. They are written probably by people who aren't directly involved in how your life is going to be run. And so don't be surprised if you read in the manual that you have to give 3 weeks notice before you take vacation. But when you're actually working in your department, you may find, oh, yeah, if you want to take a day off and it's not a problem in the department, there's no deadline that's due, and you're just giving 1 day notice, that might be perfectly fine. Other times you may find that the written policy is more lenient than the actual policy that happens in your particular department. Let's talk about performance evaluations. This is a pet peeve of mine. I was an HR attorney before I came to work at Collin College, so I was very involved in developing performance evaluation tools. And again, as I say, attorneys are very, very poor at doing this. And it's not just attorneys, I think managers generally. Part of the problem with a performance appraisal has to do with human condition. We don't like to give each other bad news. We don't like to say you're not doing X well, or you could do X better, or you need to do more of X. It sounds hurtful. It's likely to cause the other person to be defensive. And it's just a stressful situation. So many times the managing person will just say kind of non-committal things, may even leave the person who's being evaluated, leave him or her with the impression that everything's fine. But it's not. And if there's a need for a layoff or if there's an opportunity for a promotion, all the things that weren't said are still going to be considered in deciding who gets the job. So how does the worker overcome this challenge? Well, the first thing to do is to acknowledge in your own mind that it exists. If you go into an appraisal and your boss says, oh, you're doing everything great, everything's wonderful, it perhaps means that you are doing an awesome job. But nobody's perfect. There's always going to be something that you can improve upon. And one of your jobs is to figure out a way to find out what that manager isn't telling you. And that I'm going to offer you some tricks of the trade that can help you in this area in a minute. But don't assume that when you hear positive things that there aren't negative things lurking there, that they're not going to tell you. Sometimes when you hear negative things, that is a very good piece of information for a few reasons. First of all, if you know about it, you have the opportunity to fix it. Or if when you hear it, you decide, I don't want to fix that, then it lets you know that maybe this isn't the right fit for you and you ought to look for employment elsewhere. If somebody tells you the truth, there can be several things going on. One is they might just be one of those rare, very direct people who says what's on their mind. Another possibility is that they really want to help you. They could have given you the political answer, oh, everything's fine, and think about all the things they're mad at you about without telling you. Or they might think this is somebody who can really improve. I had an experience like that. I once had a mentor when I was in one of my places of employment, and he asked to meet with me, and I sat down with him, and he told me very candidly that the way I was dressing wasn't appropriate, that I was dressed too casually for the work environment. And I was embarrassed when he said that to me. But once I got back to my office, I thought, you know what? He didn't have to say that to me. And that was a kindness that he did. I'm sure he felt uncomfortable saying it, and he was doing me a kindness, and so as a result, I definitely made my dressing style more formal and more suit-oriented to fit into that work environment. So when you hear something negative, listen to it carefully and accept the parts of it that are going to be helpful for you. Try not to be defensive. Sometimes you'll have negative criticism, and there's a third possibility in play, and that is that you are being told, perhaps diplomatically, perhaps not diplomatically, that this isn't working out. And so you need to listen carefully. If you're hearing a lot of negatives, this is probably a situation where you ought to think, is this the right fit for me? Am I going to be successful here? It's better to decide or figure out that this is not a good fit, that you can't overcome, you can't perform the way they want you to. Maybe they have unrealistic expectations, maybe not, but maybe there's not a good fit, or you don't want to meet those expectations. Whatever the case is, it's much better to leave when you're on semi-good terms and when you're still employed than to leave when the situation has digressed from that point. So those are some things to think about as you're getting negative feedback. So how do you get this negative feedback? How do you persuade your manager to be candid with you? Here are some suggestions. First of all, don't wait for your annual appraisal or your 6-month appraisal. Seek out times where your boss seems to be not too harried, not too busy, has some time on his or her hands. Sit down with him or her when the flow of the conversation is good and just ask, hey, here are some good things to say. What am I doing that you like? What am I doing that you don't like? What should I do more of? What should I do less of? Phrase it that way. Don't say, is there anything you don't like? Because they're going to say no. You need to say, please tell me something. And if they start saying, oh, you're doing everything great, just say, surely there's something. Small, big, just tell me, and it may not be a big deal, but I want to improve my performance. I want to get to the next level, and I sure would appreciate your guidance helping me get to that next level. The benefit to saying this are twofold. Number one, if you say it a couple of times and reiterate it, you will get some feedback. So you will then be able to say, I now know I need to do that. Also, it leaves a very positive impression upon your boss. Wow, this person's a go-getter. This person's proactive. This person wants to succeed. Even if they never tell you what you could do better, or even if you don't improve whatever it is that they were asking you to improve, you have created an impressive impression in the minds of that person. And so that's going to pay benefits for you even if you don't actually get positive feedback. But you have to choose your moment. If you choose a moment where the person is harried, stressed out, when things aren't going well, that's not the right time to do it. Sometimes it's a good idea to plan this out. Maybe there's a time where you are maybe traveling to a particular location, you're meeting over lunch, you don't have a set agenda, so there's a little bit of relaxation time. That might be a good time to talk about, hey, what's going on. It might also be a good time for you to mention things like, I'd like to start doing X, or I think I'm ready to help you do X, or what do I need to do to get to the point that I'm going to be ready to do X. Let's say you're a litigation paralegal and you have summarized a lot of depositions, but you've never prepped a witness for a deposition. You've watched lots of witnesses being prepped, but you'd like to do a few, maybe some more minor witnesses to get your familiarity with it. And, asking is an important part of getting to that point. The attorney isn't sitting back likely and thinking, how can I develop this paralegal professionally? Some do, but most, frankly, aren't that interested. They're more focused on themselves and not necessarily focused upon the professional development of other people in the work environment. So when you let that person know, this is what I would like to do. Now, of course, when you raise an issue like this, you have to be careful. The person that you're doing this may not think you're ready. And if it's this constant harangue, why can't I do this? Why can't I do this? That's not going to leave a good impression. But something that you mention from time to time, especially when you've shown yourself open to training, open to feedback, can be a positive thing. For example, you could say, let's say the feedback is, well, I don't think you've prepped enough, or you've seen enough witnesses being prepped. Well, can I sit in on some of your witness preps? I won't even bill my time to that account just so I can see more about your techniques. Or is there a book I can read? Or is there a continuing legal education course I can attend about that? So brainstorm ways to get where you want to go. And you might come to that meeting or that conversation with some ideas. Obviously, if they say, yeah, I think you're ready for it now, great. But if they say, I don't think you're ready for it, then come up with some suggestions about how to get you there. And, of course, if the final answer is, well, no, in this law firm, this is something that attorneys only do, then you might want to come back with, well, what is an area that I can develop in? It's better if you come with some ideas. Okay, well, how about if I start doing this and this and this? Or what if I assume responsibility for this? Trying to find some way to grow professionally. Obviously, if the law firm isn't willing to give you the opportunities that you think you're ready for, it may be time for you to move on. But, of course, that's not something you would necessarily share with that employer. Another thing that's important about for performance evaluations is to have a file of your work. On the very day you have your last annual appraisal, establish a folder where you're going to put your best quality, your most important work for the next 12 months. The reason that you want to maintain a folder is so that you won't forget. You're probably going to start preparing your evaluation. Many times the employee actually prepares the first draft of the evaluation, say at the 10th or the 11th month of your appraisal cycle. Well, you remember what you did last week, even last month, maybe even 2 months ago pretty well. But what you did 10 months ago may not be so fresh in your memory. And so it's better to have a file that you can go to and say, oh, yeah, here I did this. Oh, yeah, here I did this. In a law firm, especially a large law firm, you may work with many different attorneys, and so very likely you will be asked, well, give us the names of the main attorneys with you worked for, and you'll need to give those names, and you'll want to have some examples of work that you can show those individuals. If you want to be able to say, Bob, I'm going to ask that you be one of the people that appraised me. By the way, here's some examples of work that I did for you to refresh his recollection about what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, so that can be a growth experience for you as well. So keep that file, and of course you're going to have that material for a couple of reasons. One is to help with your performance evaluation, so you'll have your best work, your most important work at hand so you can describe it. But it's also useful if you decide this place isn't working out. You'll need to have work samples for the interview process, and you'll want to have some good ones that you're going to be able to dust off and show to potential employers. Now, one thing about work samples that you'll be interested in thinking about as you develop your portfolio is that you can't use work that includes the name of your client. So you'll want to redact that information to maintain the confidentiality records, and you'll also want to redact other information that might make it obvious who your client was. For example, let's say your client was a famous football player. Well, you could redact his name, but if it's obvious given what is in the article, let's say we represented Deion Sanders in his divorce, well, you could remove his name, but if it's a Dallas Cowboy who gets divorced in Collin County and there's a custody dispute, well, it wouldn't take a lot of thought process for people to figure out, oh, you were representing Deion Sanders, so you'd have to make sure you removed enough of the specifics so that no one would be able to figure it out, even though the names have been removed. So those are some things to keep in mind in terms of performance appraisal. Another thing, too, about, as I'm looking at the list here, I'm thinking about some other things. One thing when you get started that is helpful is to have some kind of mentor or buddy in your position, ideally in the same department that you're in, who can give you a sense of the lay of the land. Sometimes there is a fair amount of gray area between the responsibilities that an attorney would have, and a paralegal would have, and a secretary would have. Knowing where those dividing lines are can be a source of a fair amount of tension in the work environment, and so it's useful to know where the lines are. For example, in a particular law firm, it might be the case that the secretary maintains the file. Well, if you take the file from the secretary might be offended and might feel like that you're usurping her role and perhaps trying to take her work away so she won't have a position. You didn't intend to do that at all. You thought that was the appropriate role for you to have. So you need to know what is the etiquette. And it might be in the given department that, well, yes, some paralegals handle the file, some secretaries handle the file, but this particular secretary always handles the file. Well, then you'll likely want to back off at least initially because you're the new person. You need to kind of play by the rules over time. Perhaps the time will come where you can say, well, I'd like to do this part of it or whatever. In other law firms, it might be that the paralegal is responsible for the file, and if you ask the secretary to maintain it, she'll feel like you're asking her to do work that's yours, and so that can be a source of tension. The takeaway isn't anything about the file particularly, but just to know what is the etiquette, who does what, where there's a gray area, how does that gray area get resolved. Also know what the performance criteria is. I'll give you an example from this perspective. Let's say that your job was being the receptionist. It's likely very important that you be at work on time. Let's say that the office opens at 8 a.m. Well, if you're there at 8:05, that's not okay because there may have been a client who came to the law firm exactly at 8 o'clock for an appointment at 8 o'clock, and he didn't have anyone to greet him, give him coffee, have him fill out any kinds of forms, or make him feel welcome. If you're a paralegal, it might be a situation in which your starting time is about 8 o'clock. If you show up at 8:05, it's no big deal. Some law firms, they don't care. As long as you put in your time, you can come and go as you wish. There are other law firms that don't feel that way at all. You need to know what the culture is in your law firm. The fact that there's no good, valid reason in your mind why you have to be there exactly 8 o'clock does not necessarily mean that other people, for example, the partner, feels the same way. So be aware, know what the standards are, and know what the written rules are, but also know what the unwritten rules are. And when you have that mentor, that buddy, listen to what they say, but also be aware that maybe your mentor or buddy has a blind spot, and you want to see how do other people act. If you notice everyone else is in their office at exactly 8 o'clock, even if everyone's saying, oh, no, it's no big deal, just come in around 8 o'clock, probably that means you need to be there at 8 o'clock. Here's a list of factors that might be considered in a performance evaluation. They're pretty common sense factors. Let me pause on and talk about especially number 8, dependability. I suppose whenever someone is being hired for any position, they're really being hired to solve a problem that the employer is having. So what I'm about to say isn't unique for paralegals, but I think it is perhaps more true for paralegals than for other positions. Let me explain. As I think I've probably said, attorneys usually have more work to do than they can confidently get done in the time. So they're constantly being rushed. They're constantly feeling a lot of time pressure. Also, attorneys, again, I'm making a huge generalization, but usually attorneys are not the best organized people. They aren't that good at organizing the file, and so things tend to be kind of chaotic around them. So when they're seeking to hire a paralegal, they are looking for somebody who can do two things. Somebody who can organize their life, making sure that they always know what the deadlines are, what needs to be done next. Kind of a hand-holder, almost like a mommy or a daddy in some sense. I've seen relationships between paralegals and attorneys where the paralegal comes in, or the attorney comes in and goes, "Okay, John, paralegal, tell us what's up for today." And so that makes sure that no deadlines are being missed because John has a tickler system. He knows exactly what the next thing on the task list is, and he plans it out not just for today but for the next week or two to make sure all the deadlines are met. That system only works when John is dependable. If John sometimes forgets to add things to the calendar, or he sometimes is late, and so the attorney is at loose ends because he doesn't know his next task is, or, God forbid, John misses work entirely on a particular day, insanity ensues. And so the problem that the attorney was trying to resolve wasn't resolved because there isn't that dependability factor. The attorney is trying to solve a problem. He's trying to make sure that he meets all of his deadlines, and the paralegal often has the role of assisting the attorney doing that. Ultimately, the attorney is responsible, but the attorney recognizes, I need a helper, or many attorneys recognize that. And that person, in order to merit that level of trust, needs to be pretty close to perfect about calendaring things, reminding, making sure things are in the pipeline to get done at the right time. Another thing that an attorney is looking for is somebody that he can safely take a project off of his desk and put it on the paralegal's desk. And he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. He knows it's going to be done on time. It's going to be done well. He doesn't have to think, oh, is John the paralegal working on it? Is it going to be ready on time? He trusts John. He knows John is going to be able to deliver. Well, if John is perennially late or misses work or doesn't do a thorough job, the attorney really, even though he's given the assignment to John, really still has to continue to worry about that. So the paralegal under those circumstances hasn't solved the problem for the attorney, and that's not a successful situation for the attorney. I'll give you an example. I once worked with two awesome paralegals. I'm going to call one Tammy and the other Teresa. Not their real names, obviously. Tammy was a brilliant writer. She could it almost was like poetry when you read what she wrote. Very smooth, very well presented, very, very well done. She had a true talent for writing. Teresa was a very fine writer. There wasn't anything wrong with her writing, but it wasn't poetry. It got what it needed to get done in an efficient, appropriate way. It was perfectly fine. No criticism of it, but it just wasn't magical. It was like comparing a good writer to Hemingway. No, the average writer is never going to be Hemingway. The average writer is not going to be Tammy. But you don't need to be Hemingway in order to be a paralegal. So that's what I had. I had Tammy, the superstar writer, and Teresa, the good, solid writer. Well, there was another characteristic about Tammy, and that was Tammy liked drama. She always seemed to know the latest gossip in the department. She sometimes was on the outs with this paralegal or this attorney, or not on the outs with this one. She had good friendships. It seemed like there was always a lot of, whoa, who's doing what, what's going on here, hurt feelings, bad feelings, just a lot of drama. And many times I did not know about it, but many times I did, and I kind of would get pulled into it. I was supervising Tammy and Teresa, and I would get pulled into it. Somebody was mad that Tammy asked her to do this when really it was Tammy's job to do, and da-da-da-da. Also, Tammy generally had good attendance, but she would miss work from time to time. And my experience is that with paralegals, really, you shouldn't be missing work. You should be at work unless you have scheduled vacation or your boss says you don't need to come in maybe because you worked the whole weekend or something like that. You really need to be very, very ill before you're going to miss work, unless there's an environment where there just isn't that much work to be done at that time, because deadlines aren't forgiven. If you're not there and deadline's missed, the client isn't going to care that you were sick, and the court's not going to say, oh, well, because you were sick, we're going to give you more time. That's not how it works. So being sick, even very occasionally, perhaps, but beyond that, if you're missing work, that's a pretty big deal if it's not scheduled. And that's really hitting at the dependability thing. So those were the two problems Tammy had. She had a lot of drama, and she would occasionally, maybe once every couple of months, would miss a day because she was sick. And that would cause a lot of chaos in the environment. Teresa, perfectly fine writer. I don't think she ever missed a day. She was rock solid in her attendance, and there was no drama with her. I can tell you every single attorney in the department wanted to have Teresa work for him or her. And they would put up with Tammy, but they weren't happy with the drama. They wanted somebody to solve their problem. Teresa solved problems, Tammy created problems. That's what you need to be, the problem solver, not the problem creator. If you start finding that you're causing drama or that you are in the center of a lot of drama, that is not a good place to be. Maybe this isn't the right fit for you, but it's not likely to be a long-term settlement because I can guarantee you the attorneys are thinking, why did we bring on this drama? We don't need extra drama in the environment. Okay, let's look at some employment policies. If there is a policy manual or an employee handbook, you may have some description of how employees are terminated. Probably that's only going to be the very biggest of law firms. Certainly, all of the legal protections that exist in any place of employment are going to exist in law firms of any size. Most of the protections about discrimination are going to start with places of employment that have 15 or more employees. So it's a very small law firm. The protections against discrimination based upon race or color or religion or gender aren't going to apply. But anything that's kind of middle-sized to above, you're going to have those types of protections. One of the biggest surprises that I found in my practice as an employment lawyer is that most employees, and for that part, most employers, don't really understand the legal nature of the employment relationship. The vast, vast majority of employees in the United States are employed at will. That's this expression right here. Let me first of all talk about the exceptions to this policy. Employees who are a member of a labor organization, a labor union, who have a collective bargaining agreement with their employer are not employed at will. That's one category. Another category are employees who have employment contracts. Typically, these are going to be senior executives in companies, certainly typically less than 5% of the workforce, usually quite a bit less than even that, might have employment contracts. I'll give you an example. There was one time when I was at Penny's that not a single employee had an employment contract. Other times where 3 or 4 had an employment contract. Other times where there might have been 20 or 30. But it was never a very significant number of the workforce. A third category are state and federal employees who have either a contract nature or a employment right, a property right associated with their employment. Again, unless you work for the government, that's not going to apply to you. So in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I think it's safe to say well over 99% of all employees are employed at will. So let's talk about what does it mean to be employed at will. It means that you as the employee at any time can quit your place of employment. You can quit for no reason, for a good reason, or for a bad reason. Moreover, you don't have to give any notice. Let's say I'm the checkout clerk at the Kroger, and I've just had one too many times where someone showed up in my line with too many coupons or whatever the issue is. And so I checked somebody out, and they fussed at me and fretted at me, and so I said, you know what, I'm done. I called the supervisor over and say, listen, I quit. I'm out of here. Here's my badge. Here's my cash register. Goodbye. And at that moment, the supervisor clocks me out. I'm out of there. Kroger has no legal recourse to force me to work anymore. They can't force me to work anymore because I was employed at will. And Kroger's might be a bad example because they are unionized. So let's make this Target. Target has no ability to force me to work a second longer than I want to. So that's how employment at will works from the employee's perspective. And most employees understand that they have that ability to quit whenever they want to. They don't need to justify their reason. But it also applies to the employer. This is the surprise. Employers can terminate an employee for any reason, a good reason, a bad reason, no reason at all, except that the reason that the employer uses cannot be an unlawful reason. So, for example, if my place of employment has over 15 workers, I can't terminate my employee because of his race or her religion or his gender. I can terminate him because he was late to work, even though he has a really good reason. I can terminate her because her skirt's a little too short or a little too long. I can terminate for silly reasons, for mean reasons, for all kinds of reasons. And as long as they're not unlawful, guess what? I have not broken any laws, and the employee cannot successfully sue me. In addition, the employer doesn't have to give any notice. Now, of course, if I fire somebody for a silly reason, for example, someone comes into work and they're wearing a green shirt, and I say, I'm firing you because you're wearing a green shirt, and the employee goes, well, you never told me I couldn't wear a green shirt. Well, yes, I know that, but I fire people that wear green shirts. Well, you should have told me that, right? Well, yeah, I should have, but I'm just going to fire you anyway. Well, that's a stupid reason to fire someone, but it's not an unlawful reason to fire someone. Having said that, the employee who was fired might say, well, you say you fired me because I was wearing a green shirt, but that doesn't make any sense. That's a silly reason to fire somebody. I think the real reason you fired me was because of my religion or because of my ethnicity or something like that. I think you came up with a pretextual reason to do this. And, of course, if the jury believes the employee and says, well, and concludes that the reason that the employer gave was really not the genuine reason for the employer's action, then the employer might become legally responsible or have some kind of damages associated with termination. But the takeaway is both parties can end the employment relationship at any time for any reason. There is no such thing as needing to give somebody notice or having to have a good reason. Now, of course, if I'm fired for a silly reason and I've been employed for at least a quarter of a year, it's very likely I'm going to be able to file for unemployment and get unemployment benefits. But that has nothing to do with the right of the employer to terminate my employment. We're going to talk about filing procedures during our next presentation. Thanks for your attention, and I'll be talking to you soon. Bye-bye.